The early morning in Manchakhiri, Khon Kan, carried a stillness that only a small village could offer. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting long shadows across the quiet two-story houses that lined the dirt roads. The occasional crow of a rooster echoed in the air, and smoke curled lazily from the rooftops as villagers prepared their morning meals. In one of those houses, a modest wooden structure with faded blue shutters, 74-year-old Toksin Pramot stood in the kitchen. The aroma of boiling rice filled the air as he stirred the pot with slow, deliberate movements. The kitchen window was open, letting in the crisp December breeze. He found peace in these quiet moments, before the world stirred. Before the weight of his choices pressed against him. The sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the calm. The first bullet ripped through the open window, narrowly missing Toksin and embedding itself in the wall behind him. Shock froze him for an instant, his hand still gripping the ladle. Then instinct took over. He ducked, the pot spilling onto the counter, hot steam rising in a cloud. A second shot came, the sound deafening in the confined space. Toksin scrambled for cover, his heart pounding like a drum. Blood slicked his hand as pain seared through his left arm. He'd been hit. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. Who would do this, and why? But deep down, he knew. Toksin stumbled through the small kitchen, his legs shaky beneath him. He clutched his bleeding arm, the warm blood soaking through his shirt. His attacker hadn't stopped, the gunshots were relentless, ringing out like a death knell. He knew the house well, every corner, every creaking floorboard, and his instincts led him to the small bathroom at the back. He locked the door, his breaths ragged, his vision blurred as he pressed a towel against his wound, trying to stem the bleeding. Outside, the footsteps grew louder, heavy and deliberate. Toksin squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to disappear, to melt into the shadows. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence, the kind of silence that suffocates. Toksin's pulse thundered in his ears. He knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. Summoning what little strength he had, he cracked the bathroom window open. The air outside was cold against his sweat-soaked skin. One glance behind him, and he hoisted himself through the small opening, the pain in his arm nearly unbearable. He landed awkwardly in the overgrown backyard, the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filling his nostrils. His head swiveled, searching for his attacker, but there was no sign of him. Not yet. Stumbling forward, he made his way toward the dirt road. His vision swam, the world around him tilting dangerously. Help, he rasped, his voice barely audible. He spotted the faint glow of a neighbor's house in the distance. And with every ounce of willpower, he dragged himself forward. Sujitra Wanarat, a 46-year-old woman with a knack for knowing everyone's business, was sipping her morning tea when she heard the commotion. The gunshots had startled her, and she stepped out onto her porch, her sharp eyes scanning the area. In the faint light of dawn, she spotted Toksin stumbling down the road, clutching his arm. Her gasp caught in her throat as she rushed to him. Toksin, what happened? She cried, reaching out to steady him. I've been shot, he managed, his voice weak, his knees buckled, and Sujitra barely caught him before he collapsed. Blood soaked his shirt, staining her hands as she tried to support him. Who did this? She asked, her voice trembling. Toksin didn't answer. His lips moved, but no sound came. His head lolled to the side, and Sujitra realized he was losing consciousness. Panic surged through her, but she was quick to act. She shouted for her husband, who came running, and together they loaded Toksin into their truck. We have to get him to the hospital, she said, her tone brooking no argument. As they sped toward the hospital in Khon Kan, Sujitra's mind raced. The shock of seeing Toksin, a man she'd known for decades, bleeding and broken, was almost too much to bear. But amidst the chaos, a single thought solidified in her mind. This was no random attack. Someone had meant to kill him. Back at Toksin's house, the air was thick with tension. Villagers had gathered at a cautious distance, murmuring among themselves. The police arrived shortly after, led by Inspector Amnart Siripong, a methodical and composed officer who had seen his share of violent crimes. But even he was struck by the brutality of the scene. Inside the house, blood smeared the kitchen floor and splattered the walls. A half-cooked pot of rice sat abandoned on the counter, its steam mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Bullet holes marred the walls, a stark testament to the violence that had unfolded. Amnart crouched near the window, examining the trajectory of the shots. Whoever did this knew exactly where to aim. He muttered. He turned to his team. Bag the evidence and secure the perimeter. We'll need statements from the neighbors. As the officers worked, a villager approached hesitantly. Inspector, the man said, his voice low. I think I know who might have done this. Amnart straightened, his gaze sharp. Go on. It's Somchai Pongjit, the man said. He's had problems with toxin for a while now. Everyone knows about it. Amnart's brow furrowed. The name was familiar. Somchai was known in the village as a quiet, hardworking man, but the more the villager spoke, the clearer the picture became. A history of arguments, rumors of betrayal, and a slow simmering rage that had finally boiled over. Somchai Pongjit sat in the police station hours later, his face pale but composed. He had turned himself in shortly after the incident, his hands trembling as he placed the gun on the desk in front of the officers. I did it, he said simply. I shot him. Amnart sat across from him, studying the man. Why? Somchai's eyes were hollow as he replied. I warned him so many times. But he wouldn't stop. Stop what? Somchai's voice cracked, the anguish in his words palpable. He was with my wife. He betrayed me. Amnart leaned back, his mind piecing together the fragments of the story. This wasn't just a crime, it was the culmination of months, perhaps years, of simmering tensions and broken trust. He knew this case would unravel layers of secrets, lies, and heartbreak, and he knew the village of Manchakhiri would never be the same. The holding cell was cold and dimly lit, its walls a pale shade of gray that matched the mood of the man sitting inside. Somchai Pongjit rested his head in his hands, his fingers laced tightly as though trying to hold himself together. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on his chest, each breath a struggle against the suffocating guilt and rage. The door to the cell block opened, and the steady footsteps of Inspector Amnart Siripong echoed off the walls. Amnart stopped in front of Somchai's cell, his sharp gaze fixed on the man. You're certain you want to confess without a lawyer present? Amnart asked, his tone measured but firm. Somchai looked up, his face pale and drawn. I don't need a lawyer, he replied. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to explain. Amnart nodded. He gestured for an officer to open the cell. And moments later, Somchai was seated in a sterile interrogation room. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting shadows across his weathered face. Let's start from the beginning, Amnart said, placing a recorder on the table. Tell me what led to this. Somchai exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the table. It started months ago. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was just gossip, neighbors talking too much, seeing things that weren't there. But then, his voice faltered, and he clenched his fists. Then I saw it with my own eyes. He recounted the first time he noticed Suda, his wife of nearly 30 years, acting differently. She was distant, distracted, often finding excuses to leave the house. Her laughter, once a source of comfort, now sounded hollow. Somchai dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the strain of daily life. But then came the nights when she didn't come home until late, her explanations vague and unconvincing. It wasn't until I saw them together that I knew, Somchai said, his voice thick with emotion. She was smiling at him. Toxin, the way she used to smile at me. Amnart listened intently, his pen scribbling notes. Did you confront her? I tried, Somchai replied. She denied it, said I was imagining things. But the lies didn't stop. And Toxin, he didn't even bother hiding it. He'd come around, make excuses to talk to her, and laugh like none of it mattered. As Somchai spoke, Amnart began piecing together the layers of betrayal. Toxin, despite his age, had a reputation in the village. Twice divorced and known for his charm. He had a history of stirring trouble wherever he went. Villagers often joked about his silver tongue and wandering eyes. But this time, his actions had led to something far darker. Suda's perspective was still missing from the story. But Amnart had a clear picture of Somchai's mounting frustration. As weeks turned into months, the tension between Somchai and Toksin escalated. They argued in public, their shouting matches drawing the attention of neighbors like Sujitra. He warned me to stay away from him. Somchai continued. He said I was being paranoid. That it was my fault. Suda was unhappy. Can you imagine? Him telling me it was my fault. Somchai's voice rose, and he slammed a fist onto the table. I begged her to end it. I begged him to leave her alone. But they didn't care. They laughed behind my back, flaunting their betrayal like it meant nothing. What happened the morning of the shooting? Amnart pressed. Somchai leaned back, his shoulders slumping. I couldn't sleep. The images kept running through my mind, her with him, laughing, whispering. I got up before dawn, grabbed the gun, and went to his house. His voice grew quieter, as if he were speaking to himself. I didn't plan to kill him. I just wanted to scare him, to make him feel what I felt every day. But when I saw him standing there, cooking in his kitchen like he didn't have a care in the world, something snapped. You fired the first shot, Amnart said, more a statement than a question. Yes, Somchai admitted, his hands trembling. And when he ran, I kept firing. I wanted him to hurt. I wanted him to feel the fear and pain he'd brought into my life. Silence hung heavy in the room. Amnart turned off the recorder, his expression unreadable. You understand the severity of what you've done? Somchai nodded, his eyes hollow. I do, and I'll accept whatever punishment comes. But I needed someone to know the truth. Later that day, Amnart visited Suda at her sister's house, where she had sought refuge after the shooting. She sat in the small living room, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her sister hovered nearby, her expression wary. You understand why I'm here? Amnart began, taking a seat across from her. Suda nodded but said nothing. What can you tell me about your relationship with Toksin? Her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked away, tears welling in her eyes. You're not on trial, Suda, Amnart said gently, but your silence isn't helping anyone. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to happen. Toksin, he listened to me in a way Somchai hadn't for years. He made me feel seen. Understood. And Somchai? Her face crumpled. I didn't want to hurt him. I thought he'd move on. Let it go. I never imagined it would come to this. As the investigation continued, the village buzzed with gossip. Some sided with Somchai, seeing him as a man pushed to the brink by betrayal. Others condemned him, arguing that no amount of pain justified his actions. Suda bore the brunt of the judgment. Whispers and pointed glances following her wherever she went. Toksin, meanwhile, remained in critical condition at the hospital. His survival was uncertain, and the village held its collective breath, waiting to see what fate had in store for the man whose actions had set everything into motion. The village of Manchakhiri had never been the same after the gunshots shattered the early morning peace. What was once a quiet community, bound by shared meals and neighborly gossip, now buzzed with tension and unease. Lines were drawn, alliances formed, and whispers turned into full-blown debates. The village square, a place where elders once gathered to sip tea and exchange light-hearted stories, became the unofficial courtroom, and the question that lingered on everyone's lips: was Somchai Pongjit a victim of betrayal or a man who allowed rage to ruin lives? Suda stayed at her sister's house. Her presence met with mixed reactions from the villagers. Some avoided her entirely, unwilling to associate with a woman they saw as the root cause of the tragedy. Others confronted her outright. You should have left, one elderly woman spat during a trip to the market. If you cared about Somchai at all, you wouldn't have let things get this far. Suda kept her head down, her hands trembling as she clutched the basket of vegetables she'd come to buy. Every encounter left her more frayed, her guilt twisting tighter around her like a noose. Her sister, Rachini, was her only solace. Don't listen to them, Rachini said one evening, placing a comforting hand on Suda's shoulder. People love to judge when they're not the ones living the pain. But Suda's pain wasn't just external. Each night, she lay awake, haunted by the look on Somchai's face the last time they'd spoken. It wasn't anger or rage that stuck with her, it was the quiet desperation. The raw vulnerability of a man clinging to the last shreds of his dignity. Back at the police station, Somchai remained cooperative, but his demeanor was one of quiet resignation. Inspector Amnart continued to dig deeper, determined to understand the man's psyche. What did you hope to accomplish, Somchai? Amnart asked during their second interrogation. Somchai stared at his hands, his voice low and steady. I wanted it to stop. The whispers, the looks, the shame. I wanted him to feel the pain I'd been living with every day. And now? Amnart pressed. Now. Somchai hesitated, his eyes clouding with regret. Now I see it didn't matter. None of it. I lost everything. Amnart scribbled notes, his pen scratching against the paper. Do you regret what you did? Somchai's response came after a long pause. I regret the pain I caused. But regret doesn't change what's done. Meanwhile, at Khon Kaen Hospital, Toxin's condition remained critical. He had survived multiple surgeries to repair the damage caused by the bullet wound to his arm and chest. But his frail body struggled to recover. Doctors warned the family that the coming days would be crucial. Suda visited once, slipping into the hospital late at night to avoid the stares of others. She sat by Toxin's bedside, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, but the sight of him stirred a mix of emotions in her heart. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I never wanted this. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. Toxin's eyelids fluttered, his lips moving faintly. Suda leaned closer, straining to hear, but his words were inaudible, lost to the rhythmic beeping of the monitors that surrounded him. The villagers were not quiet in their opinions. Every corner of the market, every bench in the square, buzzed with debates. He was pushed to it, said Mr. Warat, an elder who had known Somchai since he was a boy. How much humiliation can a man endure? Pushed to it, countered Mrs. Chanya, shaking her head. There's no excuse for violence. He had other choices. Even Sujitra, who had witnessed the aftermath firsthand, found herself torn. She had always seen Somchai as a decent man, someone who worked hard and kept to himself. But the rage she saw that morning, rage that had turned into action, painted him in a new, darker light. As the days passed, Inspector Amnart uncovered more about Toxin's past. His team pieced together a trail of broken relationships, debts, and disputes that hinted at a man who thrived on bending the rules. Toxin had a way of charming people, one villager said during questioning. But he left a trail of mess wherever he went. You could never trust him. The deeper Amnart delved, the more he began to see Toxin not as a victim, but as a man who had invited trouble into his life. Yet that didn't absolve Somchai of his actions. The law was clear, and justice had to be served. One day, Suda made the difficult decision to visit Somchai at the police station. The officers allowed her a brief meeting, and as she stepped into the small visitation room, her heart pounded. Somchai sat on the other side of the glass, his face lined with exhaustion but his eyes still sharp. Suda, he said, his voice void of emotion. Why are you here? She hesitated, her words catching in her throat. I needed to see you. To say I'm sorry. Sorry? Somchai let out a bitter laugh. Are you sorry for what you did? Or sorry for what it cost? Tears streamed down Suda's face. I never meant for it to end like this. Somchai's gaze softened, the bitterness giving way to something deeper, sorrow. Neither did I. But here we are. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared grief hanging between them. When the guards signaled that the visit was over, Suda stood, her legs shaky beneath her. As she turned to leave, Somchai's voice stopped her. Suda. She looked back, her eyes red and swollen. Take care of yourself, he said quietly. Toxin eventually regained consciousness, though his recovery was slow and fraught with complications. His statement to the police corroborated much of what had already been uncovered. He admitted to the affair but claimed he never believed it would escalate to violence. I thought Somchai would cool off, he told Inspector Amnart during an interview. I underestimated his anger. But Amnart pressed further. And you? Do you take responsibility for the role you played in all of this? Toxin's expression darkened. I didn't force anyone to do anything. People make their own choices. It was a response that cemented his reputation among the villagers. To many, Toxin was no victim. He was the match that lit the flame. As the legal proceedings began, the community remained polarized. Somchai's trial loomed, promising to unearth even more secrets and force everyone involved to confront the consequences of their actions. Inspector Amnart stood outside the courthouse one evening, the weight of the case pressing on his shoulders. He looked out at the village, the setting sun casting long shadows over the fields. This isn't just about guilt or innocence, he murmured to himself. It's about the scars that betrayal leaves behind. The courthouse in Khon Kaen was a modest building, its worn steps and pale facade a quiet reminder of the many lives that had been judged within its walls. Villagers gathered outside, murmuring among themselves as Somchai Pongjit was led in, flanked by officers. His face was stoic, his gaze fixed ahead, as if bracing for the storm that awaited him inside. Suda watched from a distance, her hands clutching the fabric of her skirt. She hadn't decided whether to attend the proceedings but felt compelled to come. If only to see the man she had once called her husband. A knot of guilt tightened in her chest as she noticed the way the villagers looked at her, a mix of pity, disdain, and curiosity. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with anticipation. Inspector Amnart sat among the observers, his notepad ready. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Kamala Thepchai, began her case with precision. Ladies and gentlemen, Kamala said, her voice clear and firm. This is a case about betrayal and rage. But no matter the personal circumstances, we cannot excuse violence. The defendant, Somchai Pongjit, took the law into his own hands and nearly ended a man's life. Somchai's lawyer, a local attorney named Arun Yothan, countered, this case is not as simple as it seems. My client is a man pushed to his limits, betrayed by those closest to him. He acted in a moment of despair, not out of malice but out of pain. The lines were drawn. The trial would not only determine Somchai's fate but also force everyone involved to confront the truths they had tried to bury. Toxin arrived in a wheelchair, his once robust frame now gaunt and frail. His left arm was in a sling, and his breathing was labored. He took the stand, his voice trembling but defiant. I didn't deserve this, he said, glancing at Somchai. Yes, I made mistakes, but mistakes don't justify murder. The prosecutor leaned in. Mr. Promote, can you describe your relationship with Mrs. Suda Pongjit? Toxin hesitated, then nodded. We were close. I won't deny that, but I never intended to cause harm. I believed Suda was unhappy in her marriage, and I offered her companionship. And were you aware of the strain this caused in Mr. Pongjit's marriage? Toxin's jaw tightened. I thought he'd get over it. I didn't think it was my responsibility. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Toxin's words, though honest, painted him as a man unwilling to take accountability. Inspector Amnart noted the reactions carefully, knowing public perception could weigh heavily in a case like this. When Suda was called to the stand, she felt every pair of eyes in the room on her. Her heart pounded as she swore the oath, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Pongjit, Kamala began. Can you explain your relationship with Mr. Toxin Promote? Suda's hands trembled, and she clasped them tightly together. We were friends at first. He listened to me, made me feel understood in a way I hadn't felt in years. And this friendship turned romantic? Kamala pressed. Suda nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Yes, I know it was wrong. I know I hurt Somchai. But I never imagined it would lead to this. Kamala's tone softened slightly. Did Mr. Pongjit ever express his anger or confront you about the relationship? Many times, Suda admitted. He begged me to end it. He warned us both. But I didn't listen. When Arun cross-examined her, his questions were more personal. Mrs. Pongjit, do you regret your actions? Yes, Suda said, her voice breaking. Every day. Do you believe Mr. Pongjit's anger was justified? Suda hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but I don't believe what he did was right. When Somchai took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He sat straight-backed, his hands resting on the table in front of him. I'm not here to deny what I did, He began, his voice steady. I shot Toxin. I won't make excuses for that. But I want you to understand why. He recounted the months of betrayal. The humiliation he felt every time he saw Suda and Toxin together. His voice cracked as he described the arguments, the warnings, and the night he discovered them laughing together in the backyard. That night, Somchai said, his eyes glistening with tears, I realized I'd lost everything. My wife, my dignity, my peace. I didn't know how to live with that. Arun guided him gently. And the morning of the shooting? I wasn't thinking clearly, Somchai admitted. I wanted to scare him. To make him feel the fear I felt every day. But when I saw him, something inside me snapped. He lowered his gaze, his voice barely a whisper. I regret what I did. I wish I could take it back. But I can't. As the trial unfolded, Inspector Amnart found himself grappling with his own emotions. He had seen crimes of passion before. But this case felt different. The pain was raw, palpable, and deeply human. It wasn't about greed or malice, it was about love, betrayal, and the fragility of trust. During a break, Amnart spoke with Sujitra, who had come to observe. What do you make of it? He asked. Sujitra sighed. I think everyone's to blame in their own way. But that doesn't mean Somchai should walk free. Amnart nodded. It's a tragedy, no matter how you look at it. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached a decision. The courtroom was packed as the judge read the verdict. Somchai Pongjit, you are found guilty of attempted murder. However, given the mitigating circumstances, the court recommends a reduced sentence. Gasps filled the room. Somchai lowered his head, his shoulders sagging with relief and resignation. He had expected the worst but knew he still had a price to pay. In the days following the trial, the village remained divided. Some saw the verdict as justice. Others as too lenient. Toxin returned to his home. Though his health remained fragile, Suda moved in with her sister. Her future uncertain, Somchai began his prison sentence with a quiet resolve. Determined to reflect on the choices that had led him there. Letters from Suda arrived occasionally. But he wasn't ready to read them. Inspector Amnart closed his notebook one final time. The case officially resolved but the emotional wounds still fresh. As he walked through the village, he saw its scars, relationships frayed, trust broken, and lives forever altered. Months later, Sujitra stood outside her home. Watching the sunset, the village was quieter now. The events of the past fading into memory but leaving their mark. Sometimes, she mused aloud, it's not about who's right or wrong. It's about how much we're willing to forgive. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the fields in golden light, the village of Manchakhiri began to heal, slowly but surely.